During the Great Depression, which I'm old enough to remember, there was, and most of my family were unemployed, working class, there wasn't, it was bad, much worse subjectively than today, but there was an expectation that things were going to get better. There was a real sense of hopefulness. There isn't today.
Yeah, and I don't know if you agree or disagree with that, but welcome to my channel. My name is Mckensy Long, and I'm really excited to have you. And so we talk about all things finance and all things that have to do with understanding how money works. And this is going to be a great video for you today. It's going to be a little bit long, but we have so much to go through. And I promise you, if you stick through till the end, there's going to be a ton of information that you're going to be able to use to understand why you feel the way that you feel, not just about money, but about life, because I think money impacts all aspects of our life. But you'll also understand a lot of the things that kind of are in competition for our money, and more importantly, why.
It's been a concerted effort on the part of the masters of mankind, the owners of the society. They, in fact, overwhelmingly regarded wage labor as not very different from slavery, different only in that it was temporary. The idea is to try to control everyone with a very explicit design to increase insecurity, putting working people in competition with one another. Huge increase in the flows of speculative capital, enormous changes in the financial sector, banks, risky investments, complex financial instrument, money manipulations. Now the shift is towards trying to keep taxes just on wages and on consumption. They can fabricate wants, make obtaining things the essence of life. They're going to be trapped into becoming consumers. Meanwhile, highly paid professionals are protected.
And one thing that I think is really important to understand as we learn how money works is that there are more things that are impacting us than just ourselves. Sometimes we can feel like it's just our issue with money, and we don't understand all of the things that have happened before we were even born to program us or to show us what's supposed to be important in our life, kind of like you mentioned. And one of those things I think is the American dream. And the American dream is supposed to be that you can come here no matter what kind of background or religion or color you are, and you can have success in life. However, I wonder if people really feel that way today, as things have gotten tremendously harder, especially just over these last couple of years with COVID. And understanding how money works is becoming more and more important. As he mentioned, all of the changes that have happened in the financial institutions, that have happened with taxes, that have happened with corporations and people, and the impact that that has on our lives is huge. And so maybe you've been feeling this weird kind of feeling going on. Maybe it's been a little bit eerie for you as well as I have. And I often have these conversations with my wife, and this guy, Noam Chomsky, has a great opinion about these things, and I really want you to hear them. But I talk about this with my wife, and we ask ourselves, like, why don't we know our neighbors, right? Because growing up, I don't know if it was similar in your area as it was with me, but we knew all of our neighbors. We would walk into our neighbor's home. We would grab food out of their refrigerator. We would hang out. We would do dinners. We would do all of that stuff. And now, I don't know, probably for the last 5 years or so, we don't even really know who our neighbors are other than when we say hi in passing, but we don't really do anything for each other. And so what has changed? Is it by design? Is it just that people have changed? Or what is going on in society? And I promise you this, that you're going to get a lot out of this video. It is a little bit long, but stick till the end because there's some great points that are going to be made. And I think you're going to love this video. Oh, and if you really want more information, the original video is going to be down below. But let's go ahead. We got no time to waste. Let's get into it.
You opened by talking about the American dream. Part of the American dream is class mobility. You're born poor, you work hard, you get rich. It was possible for a worker to get a decent job, buy a home, get a car, have his children go to school. It's all collapsed. In the United States, there are professed values like democracy. In a democracy, public opinion is going to have some influence on policy. It's important to understand that privileged and powerful sectors have never liked democracy, and for very good reasons. Democracy puts power into the hands of the general population and takes it away from them. It's kind of a principle of concentration of wealth and power. In 1776, you read famous Wealth of Nations. He says in England, the principal architects of policy are the people who own the society. In his day, merchants and manufacturers. Now it's not merchants and manufacturers, it's financial institutions and multinational corporations. The people who Adam Smith called the masters of mankind. And they're following the vile maxim, all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. They're just going to pursue policies that benefit them and harm everyone else. And in the absence of a general popular reaction, that's pretty much what you'd expect.
So as you can see, what Norm is talking about is this, the changes that have happened, and that we live in a democratic society, but there's really forces that are opposed to that, that they don't really believe that you or myself are smart enough to actually make good decisions. And so that's why democracy really isn't a good idea. This is kind of their thinking and not ours, is that since you don't really know much and you aren't very well involved in society, why should your vote count as much as theirs? Why should we actually have democracy? And so one of the things that they're always concerned about is how much democracy should we have? And it's a balance of freedom and democracy from the bottom, and kind of some of the things that their thoughts and beliefs about us coming in from the top. And they're not necessarily the greatest. And that's where a lot of these policies and procedures come from, because they want to limit that power that we have. And so that's why I think it's so important. And I think it's so kind of frustrating with the things that are going on in society, of why we feel like our vote doesn't really matter, why we don't really feel this calling to go out and actually vote for the people that we would want to have in office. And that's a very unique feeling. And if you look at it, people are more likely to go towards trying to win the mega bucks or those kinds of lottery things. There's more people involved in that than there are actually in the democratic process of deciding who our presidents should be. And so this video is going to kind of be a little bit on the political side to start, and I don't want to get too involved into left and right. And he does a great job at talking about kind of the issues with both sides. But I really want this to help shape and form your ideology of understanding how money works and the forces that are going to be impacted, and how important it is to understand how these things work and some of the things that we can do to really put ourselves into a better position.
Right through American history, there's been an ongoing clash between pressure for more freedom and democracy coming from below and efforts at elite control and domination coming from above. It goes back to the founding of the country. James Madison, the main framer, who was as much of a believer in democracy as anybody in the world that day, nevertheless felt that the United States system should be designed, and indeed, with his initiative, was designed so that power should be in the hands of the wealthy, because the wealthy are the more responsible set of men. And therefore, the structure of the formal constitutional system placed most power in the hands of the Senate. Remember, the Senate was not elected in those days. It was selected from the wealthy. Men, as Madison put it, had sympathy for property owners and their rights. If you read the debates at the Constitutional Convention, Madison said the major concern of the society has to be to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And he had arguments. Suppose everyone had to vote freely. He said, well, the majority of the poor would get together and they would organize to take away the property of the rich. And he said that would obviously be unjust, so you can't have that. So therefore, the constitutional system has to be set up to prevent democracy. So same problem, opposite solutions. One is reduce inequality, you won't have this problem. The other is reduce democracy.
So as you can tell, The powerful, the ones that really run this country, and you can kind of decide who you think those people are, aren't really interested in us being able to have our own sovereignty, to be able to make a lot of these decisions. And so, what we're really going to get into is the impact that some of those things have, and really how they feel about us, and then what that means for our finances and why they make the decisions that they make. And I think that that's a really important distinction to understand.
There has been an enormous, concentrated, coordinated business offensive beginning in the 70s to try to beat back the egalitarian efforts that went right through the Nixon years. You see it in many respects. I mean, over on the right, you see it in things like the famous Powell Memorandum sent to the Chamber of Commerce, the major business lobby, by later Supreme Court Justice Powell, warning them that business is losing control over the society. And something has to be done to counter these forces. Of course, he puts it in terms of defense, defending ourselves against outside power. But if you look at it, it's a call for business to use its control over resources to carry out a major offensive to beat back this democratizing wave. Over on the liberal side, there's something exactly similar. The first major report of the Trilateral Commission is concerned with this. It's called the Crisis of Democracy. Trilateral Commission is liberal internationalists. Their flavor is indicated by the fact that they pretty much staffed the Carter administration. They were also appalled by the democratizing tendencies of the 60s and thought we have to react to it. They were concerned that there was an excess of democracy developing. Previously passive and obedient parts of the population, what are sometimes called the special interests, were beginning to organize and try to enter the political arena. And they said that imposes too much pressure on the state. It can't deal with all these pressures. So therefore they have to return to passivity and become depoliticized. They were particularly concerned with what was happening to young people. The young people are getting too free and independent.
None of us will begin any violence. If there's any violence, it will be because of the police.
The way they put it, there's a failure on the part of the schools, the universities, and churches, the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. Their phrase, not mine.
So as you can tell, this is kind of a great build up into where we're going. And so you can kind of understand some of the politics behind it. I don't want to spend too much time on this break, and we're really going to kind of get into a little bit more of the information.
Since the 1970s, there's been a concerted effort on the part of the masters of mankind, the owners of the society, to shift the economy in two crucial respects. One, to increase the role of financial institutions, banks, investment firms, and so on, insurance companies. By 2007, right before the latest crash, they had literally 40% of corporate profits. Financial institutions used to be a relatively small part of the economy, and their task was to distribute unused assets, like, say, bank savings, to productive activity.
The bank always has on hand a reserve of money received from the stockholders and depositors. On the basis of these cash reserves, a bank can create credit. So besides providing a safe place for depositing money, a bank serves a community by making additional credit available for many purposes. For a manufacturer to meet his payroll during slack selling period, for a merchant to enlarge and remodel his store, and for many other good reasons why people are always needing more credit than they have immediately available.
That's a contribution to the economy. There had been, remember, no financial crashes during the period of regulation. By the 1970s, that changed. You started getting a huge increase in the flows of speculative capital, just astronomically increased. Enormous changes in the financial sector, from traditional banks to risky investments, complex financial instruments, money manipulations, and so on. By the 1970s, say General Electric could make more profit playing games with money than you could by producing in the United States. So that's one phenomenon, what's called financialization of the economy. Going along with that is the offshoring of production. The trade system was reconstructed with a very explicit design of putting working people in competition with one another all over the world. And what it's led to is a reduction in the share of income on the part of working people. It's been particularly striking in the United States, but it's happening worldwide. It means that an American worker is in competition with a super exploited worker in China. Meanwhile, highly paid professionals are protected. They're not placed in competition with the rest of the world, far from it. Policy is designed to increase insecurity. Alan Greenspan, when he testified to Congress, he explained his success in running the economy as based on what he called greater worker insecurity. Keep workers insecure, they're going to be under control. They are not going to ask for, say, decent wages or decent working conditions or the opportunity of free association, meaning unionize. Now, for the masters of mankind, that's fine. They make their profits. But for the population, it's devastating. Well, these two processes, financialization and offshoring, are part of what led to the vicious cycle of concentration of wealth, concentration of power.
So Norm brings up some great points here that he kind of even just glosses over. This is the introduction to bringing in debt into our society, right? Before that, we didn't really have debt, right? You purchased it when you had the money to do so. And so now they're starting to bring in these debts. And so now you can start having the challenges that kind of come along with that. The introduction of financial firms and how important that is. And all of these things of offshoring jobs to the outside now makes us in competition. And the actual idea that they want workers to not feel secure, and that part of keeping a higher percentage of the population working is that they don't feel secure with their finances, that helps to drive them to actually do more, and that creates more production. So to me, this kind of encompasses the idea that they want us living paycheck to paycheck. They want us to be driven because of our need to survive and our desire to survive, instead of because we want to. And I think this causes a lot of people to work at jobs that they don't really care about. It causes them to not really care about those jobs. And so they don't necessarily put their best foot forward. They're there just kind of for the paycheck because they need to survive. And you can imagine all of the things that are kind of encompassed with that when that's the premise going forward for being able to have a high percentage of the population working, is if they can help kind of control us if we don't really feel secure with our jobs. So I think that's an important note to take there as well.
The American dream, like many ideals, was partly symbolic, but partly real. So in the 1950s and 60s, say, there was the biggest growth period in American economic history. It was pretty egalitarian growth, so the lowest fifth of the population was improving about as much as the upper fifth. And there were some welfare state measures which improved life for much of the population. It was, for example, possible for a black worker to get a decent job in an auto plant, buy a home, get a car, have his children go to school, and so on, and the same across the board. When the U.S. was primarily a manufacturing center, it had to be concerned with its own consumers. Here, famously, Henry Ford raised the salary of his workers so they'd be able to buy cars. When you're moving into an international plutonomy, as the banks like to call it, with a small percentage of the world's population that's gathering increasing wealth. What happens to American consumers is of much less concern, because most of them aren't going to be consuming your products anyway, at least on any major basis. Your goals are profit in the next quarter, even if it's based on financial manipulations, high salary, high bonuses, produce overseas if you have to, and produce for the wealthy classes here and their counterparts abroad. What about the rest? Well, there's a term coming into use for them too. They're called the precariat, precarious proletariat, the working people of the world who live increasingly precarious lives. During the period of great growth of the economy, 50s and 60s, but in fact earlier, taxes on the wealthy were far higher. Corporate taxes were much higher, taxes on dividends were much higher, simply taxes on wealth were much higher. The tax system has been redesigned so that the taxes that are paid by the very wealthy are reduced, and correspondingly the tax burden on the rest of the population is increased. Now the shift is towards trying to keep taxes just on wages and on consumption, which everyone has to do, not say on dividends, which only go to the rich. The numbers are pretty striking.
So here Norm's talking about a lot of the changes that happened. And again, we're going fast over some of these things, but I want to bring up some points that he made, and that this is really the shift of burdens onto the American people. And I think this is where we started to lose pensions and we started to lose a lot of those things, and that the shift of the burden ends up on the people. And if you don't really understand a pension, I have a great video on that, talking about the retirement gamble. It's fantastic. But pensions were put on by the business, but pensions were put on by the business that we worked for, and so they put money away for us to be able to have a retirement, similar to Social Security, but it was done for by the business. And that was one of the securities that the American people had, was that they knew that money was being put into Social Security, money was being put into pensions, and then they were doing some personal savings. So between those three things, retirement was pretty simple to plan for. But what's happened then is this shift of the burden onto the people, and now that we're also responsible for planning our retirement, and that pensions are pretty much gone unless you work for the government, and that Social Security is failing, which we'll talk about even later, and some of the things that are going on with that. So really the responsibility is all on the American people to plan for our retirement, and this is why it's so important to understand how money works. But simultaneously, the burdens of society have also been shifted onto the middle and lower class, and that paying higher and higher taxes. Now, this is kind of I shouldn't say kind of, it's very debatable on how you feel about taxes and some of those things, which we'll also talk about in the future, but this is really setting the stage for where things are now and why we feel the way that we feel. But there's this overall pressing of consciousness from the elites to put more of that responsibility onto the American people.
Solidarity is quite dangerous. From the point of view of the masters, you're only supposed to care about yourself and not about other people, is a fundamental human trait. But that has to be driven out of people's heads. You got to wait for yourself, follow the Weil maxim, don't care about others, which is okay for the rich and powerful, but is devastating for everyone else. And we see it today in policy formation. For example, in the attack on Social Security. Social Security is based on a principle. It's based on a principle of solidarity. Social Security means I pay payroll taxes so that the widow across town can get something to live on. For much of the population, that's what they survive on. It's of no use to the very rich, so therefore there's a concerted attempt to destroy it. One of the ways is defunding it. You want to destroy some system, first defund it. Then it won't work, people will be angry, they want something else. We see it in the attack on public schools. Public schools are based on the principle of solidarity. The public education system, all the way from kindergarten to higher education, is under severe attack. I mean, that's one of the jewels of American society. Right now, more than half the states, most of the funding for the colleges comes from tuition, not from the state. That's a radical change. And that's a terrible burden on students. It means that students, if they don't come from very wealthy families, they're going to leave college with big debts. And if you have a big debt, you're trapped.
Which is exactly what we're seeing now, right? These huge debts of kids coming out of college, and we're having to kind of debate if it's even worth it to send our kids to college. And so you can see this kind of all stacking on top of each other. Now Social Security is kind of being defunded, and I have some different views on that. I think that Social Security has been raided a whole bunch of times. They've taken all kinds of money out of it, and so it's not really performed the way that it was supposed to. So I think there's two different classifications or types of people that feel that Social Security should be dissolved. Just from my personal financial side, I don't understand how so much money can go into Social Security and such little is paid out to the American people. So my thoughts, and sometimes you'll see me talk about this, I have other videos about Social Security, my thoughts on maybe getting rid of Social Security would really be more of a redesign. Not that we shouldn't have it, but I think that money could be put to better use in that there would be actually something for people to retire on. If you look at how much money goes in to Social Security and how little we get out of it, it's kind of amazing. When you look at the same numbers and you were saying, well, if we took that same money out of the same person's paycheck, but we let it get a 6, 7, 8, 9% rate of return and it grew over time, there would actually be some decent amount of money there, much more than they would be getting from Social Security. And then also in Social Security, if you pass away, let's say you put $3 million into Social Security through the course of your life, you pass away, your family gets none of that. Your wife doesn't even get to add it to her Social Security to where she would get two. No, she just gets the higher of the two. So if yours happens to be $500 a month more, she just gets the additional $500. She doesn't get two. And so if we had that put into an account for us, and we actually passed away before we used it, that would be left to our heirs. But unfortunately, that's not what happens in Social Security. So there's multiple issues with Social Security. So I think there's some different thoughts on maybe it being replaced with something versus necessarily it just being gone because of a lack of solidarity. But I do agree with that feeling of solidarity. And maybe you do too. Let me ask you, how well do you actually know your neighbors now compared to how well you knew them a while ago? Just 10, 15 years ago, and I remember growing up, we were always very close with our neighbors. And talking to my wife, Marlene, same thing, and she grew up in Cuba. Now they're still very much that way. A lot of that still kind of changed, but they're still a little bit more impactful, kind of because they have to. They kind of rely on each other to survive. And now, here in America, I don't feel that way. We hardly know our neighbors, and I wouldn't say we've gone to great lengths, but we've tried to get to know our neighbors better, and there's just not a common theme behind that. And I feel this way teaching financial literacy as well, in that people are kind of just all in it for themselves. Maybe this is a Vegas thing, maybe it's not as much that way as where you live, but we're seeing it across the board. We're seeing it in churches. People are tithing less. People are donating less. And I wonder if part of that is the feeling of we're giving all of this money in taxes, but it's not going where we want it to go. That if we could somehow maybe pick what we wanted our taxes to go to, where, obviously some of it would have to be, money goes there, maybe the military and the fire department and all of those things that we love and roads and all of that kind of stuff. But what if we got to select where we wanted the rest of it to kind of go, a percentage of it to go, or maybe we wanted it to go to housing for the poor, or we wanted to go to these other areas? I wonder if people would have more solidarity and they would feel better about giving their tax money away because they got to choose. Whereas now, there's a lot of things that I disagree with my taxes going to. So I don't know if you feel the way I do, but I would prefer to pay as little taxes as possible simply because I don't like the direction and where those dollars are going. And maybe you agree, maybe you don't, but with sending money to wars and to other countries and funding all these crazy things that I don't really agree with, maybe you feel that way too. But maybe that's why we have less solidarity, because we're kind of being, this money is being taken out of our pocket, and we feel like we have no real control of the ballot box, and we have no real control of where those dollars go. So it doesn't feel like we're involved in the process. And I love the way that he talked about schools and coming out with a bunch of student loan debt. We're seeing that get worse and worse. And part of that, I don't think, is just the society's fault on how much it's contributing to it, but also what these colleges are allowed to sell as a diploma is very, very fascinating. And so Norm is bringing up all these points that have a huge impact on our dollars and how we feel about society. And I really appreciate that. And then also what we kind of talked about with Social Security falling apart, that it's not really been designed, or it's not really there, I think, for the American people. I think it keeps getting robbed from people in the government, and they're able to take money from it and do IOUs and all of this crazy stuff that I don't necessarily agree with. But I love the way that this is all kind of building on top of each other, and why we feel and why our economy is the way that it is.
If you look over the history of regulation, so take, say, Reagan. Instead of letting them pay the costs, Reagan bailed out banks like Continental Illinois, the biggest bailout of American history at the time. In 1999, regulation was dismantled to separate commercial banks from investment banks. Then comes the Bush, then Obama bailout.
Bear Stearns is running to the feds to stay afloat.
President Bush today defended the decision to bail out Citigroup.
Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have asked for a total of $3 billion more. This bailout could get much bigger, signaling deepening troubles for the U.S. economy.
And they're building up the next one. Each time, the taxpayer is called on to bail out those who created the crisis, increasingly the major financial institutions. In a capitalist economy, you wouldn't do that. In a capitalist system, that would wipe out the investors who made risky investments. But the rich and powerful, they don't want a capitalist system. They want to be able to run to the nanny state as soon as they're in trouble and get bailed out by the taxpayer. Meanwhile, for the poor, let market principles prevail. Don't expect any help from the government. The government's the problem, not the solution, and so on. That's essentially neoliberalism. And it has this dual character, which goes right back in economic history. One set of rules for the rich, opposite set of rules for the poor.
And I think you can definitely feel that today. That's gotten worse, I think, now more than ever. We can see there's these two standards of justice, and it's become so politicized that you can literally tell the difference between what sentence somebody's going to get depending on what side of the aisle they're on and what their ideology is. So we're seeing a huge divide as far as that goes, and I think that's a huge impact on what we're seeing in our society as well. And so why would you want to pay taxes into a system like that if you don't feel like you're heard and you don't feel like your opinion matters? And in fact, when you do voice your opinion, you get silenced, or you get higher sentencing than other people based on who you would want to vote for, or how you feel about society and what your beliefs are and what your religions are. And this divide, to me, I don't know how you feel about it, but has gotten worse now more than ever. And that it continues to grow in between the two. And while all of these burdens are happening financially, well, now we're getting the burden of these companies, these financial companies that go out of business, and we have to go in and save them. We've got to go in and save Fannie and Freddie Mac and all of these companies with what happened with real estate in 2008. And so why aren't we allowing these companies to actually fail when they don't do a good job? And that's because a lot of times that the people who are donating to the politicians, they've got this safety net in that they're going to also be taken care of on the back end if things don't go well. And that's not really a capitalistic society. It should be that if you make poor investments, that you end up losing your money. You shouldn't be protected by the government, that you can continually make bad decisions and you constantly get bailed out from the American people. And so this again, I think, is another issue to bring up on why we don't feel like our taxes really get used in the way that we would want them to get used. And all of these things are an attack really on the middle and lower class in their taxes and how much they're paying towards those things, because ultimately we're the ones that have to bail these guys out, and they're the ones that are making all of the money and all the profits. So it brings them some very interesting topics that I think are important to understand that are going on behind the scenes when you're planning your finances and you're trying to do a better job financially, that there's all of these things going on that impact you that you may or may not feel like you have much control over. And I'm not saying you need to dive into each one of these things to really understand it, but when you feel like it's hard to save, that's kind of on purpose, right? That's the point, is that it's not supposed to be easy to do, and that's precisely what they're getting at here.
Concentration of wealth yields concentration of political power, particularly so as the cost of elections skyrockets, which kind of forces the political parties into the pockets of major corporations. The 14th Amendment has a provision that says no person's rights can be infringed without due process of law. And the intent clearly was to protect freed slaves. It says, okay, they've got the protection of the law. I don't think it's ever been used for freed slaves, if ever, marginally. Almost immediately it was used for businesses, corporations. Their rights can't be infringed without due process of law. So they gradually became persons under the law. They give corporations rights way beyond what persons have. In the 1970s, the courts decided that money is a form of speech. Buckley versus Valeo. And then you go on through the years to Citizens United, which says that the right of free speech of corporations, namely spend as much money as they want, can't be curtailed. Take a look at what that means. It means that corporations, which anyway have been pretty much buying elections, are now free to do it with virtually no constraint.
So exactly kind of what we were talking about in that same thought process of really why the two hands are washing themselves, if you will, and why these things are able to happen, and that a company can fail and then somehow they get all of this money back. And it's not that it happens once, it's not that it happens twice, it seems to happen over and over and over again. And oftentimes they just change the name on the top. Maybe the CEO gets fired and goes and works somewhere else, but no real change gets to happen because they can make these terrible decisions. And then there's no big deal because the government, and more importantly, the taxpayer, are going to bail these guys out. And I thought it was very interesting how he talked about the difference in corporations becoming persons. And this really dives into when you start a business and you become an LLC, an S Corp, a C Corp, there's some very unique things that get to happen. I think that it's really important to understand why you might want to have a business, or at least have some kind of LLC, S Corp, so that you get treated very differently than you do just as an American citizen. As a citizen, you're really burdened with a lot more of the taxes. You're burdened with a lot more of the challenges that kind of come with your finances. So if you can dive a little bit more into that and understanding why starting a business, why even if you're W-2 and you start a business of your own, there are so many tax benefits that you can get by doing that. Even if your business isn't profitable for years at a time, a lot of those things that you use for your business become write-offs. And so that's a whole nother topic for another day on all of this power that was given to businesses and corporations. But you as an individual, if you learn how to take advantage of these things, you also can operate as a corporation independent of yourself, which changes a lot of the way in that you get taxed and allows you to keep a lot more of your money.
Now, if you're in a position of power, you want to maintain class consciousness for yourself, but eliminate it everywhere else. You go back to the 19th century, in the early days of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, working people were very conscious of this. They, in fact, overwhelmingly regarded wage labor as not very different from slavery, different only in that it was temporary. In fact, it was such a popular idea, that was a slogan of the Republican Party. Well, that was a very sharp class consciousness in the interests of power and privilege. It's good to drive those ideas out of people's heads. You don't want them to know that they're an oppressed class. So this is one of the few societies in which you just don't talk about class. In fact, the notion of class is very simple. Who gives the orders, who follows them? That basically defines class. It's more nuanced and complex, but that's basically it.
And aren't we seeing a lot more of that too, in that the difference in class also changes how you get prosecuted by the law? And we're seeing a lot of that happen right now in politics, and the way that you're treated is very different depending on whether you're the one giving the orders or whether you're the one that's supposed to be following them. And so I think this is a very, very unique topic to dive into. It's a little bit more on the political side, but it also happens to do with our finances, that those people that are on the top have different rules and regulations for their finances than the people who are on the bottom. Now, the nice part is, because we have that separation, is that you have the ability to be able to do it, but nobody's going to teach you these things other than you've got to go out and learn it, or you've got to get a financial professional to help you understand these different aspects of it. And they all tie in together. But if you can choose which set of rules you want to live under, and in a lot of cases, if you have a business, you can kind of do both, and you can take advantage of both sides of them and the positives and negatives on both, which is really kind of cool. But it's a whole nother thing that we've got to learn to be able to understand, to be able to use it and take advantage of it.
The public relations industry, the advertising industry, which is dedicated to creating consumers, it's a phenomenon that developed in the freest countries, in Britain and the United States. And the reason is pretty clear. It became clear by, say, a century ago, that it was not going to be so easy to control the population by force. Too much freedom had been won. Labor organizing, parliamentary labor parties in many countries, women starting to get the franchise and so on. So you had to have other means of controlling people. And it was understood and expressed that you have to control them by control of beliefs and attitudes. Well, one of the best ways to control people in terms of attitudes, Veblen called fabricating consumers. If you can fabricate wants, make obtaining things that are just about within your reach the essence of life, they're going to be trapped into becoming consumers. You read the business press, say, 1920s, it talks about the need to direct people to the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption, and that'll keep them out of our hair. You find this doctrine all through progressive intellectual thought, like Walter Lippmann, the major progressive intellectual of the 20th century. He wrote famous progressive essays on democracy, in which his view was exactly that. The public must be put in their place so that the responsible men can make decisions without interference from the bewildered herd. They're to be spectators, not participants, then you get a properly functioning democracy. And it's done with great sophistication. The ideal is what you actually see today, where, let's say, teenage girls, if they have a free Saturday afternoon, will go walking in the shopping mall, not to the library or somewhere else. The idea is to try to control everyone to turn the whole society into the perfect system, a society based on a dyad, a pair. The pair is you and your television set, or maybe now you and the internet, in which that presents you with what the proper life would be, what kind of gadgets you should have. And you spend your time and effort gaining those things which you don't need and you don't want, and maybe you'll throw them away. But that's the measure of a decent life. Markets are supposed to be based on informed consumers making rational choices. Well, if we had a system like that, a market system, then a television ad would consist of, say, General Motors putting up information saying, here's what we have for sale. That's not what an ad for a car is. An ad for a car is a football hero, an actress, the car doing some crazy thing like going up a mountain or something. The point is to create uninformed consumers who will make irrational choices. And when the same institutions, PR system, runs elections, they do it the same way. They want to create an uninformed electorate which will make irrational choices, often against their own interests. And we see it every time one of these extravaganzas take place.
Yeah, and so as you can kind of tell what he's talking about there, and you've probably felt this way, and this has been one of the greatest things that I've learned from being in the financial industry is really what things make me happy. And to be able to look at a budget and then spend more money on things that make me happy versus just the things that I thought that I wanted. And you have probably had similar experiences as me in that you save up a bunch of money, or maybe you get into a bunch of debt and you buy this thing and you feel excited about it, right? Because it was something that you thought that you really wanted. You thought it would make you happy. You thought maybe the clothes or the car or the house or whatever it might be that you bought financially, maybe a boat, and then you get it and then you're excited for a little while, but it kind of dies off. That better life that you thought that you were going to have from buying this thing goes away over time. That new car, after 2, 3, maybe 6 months, it's not as cool as it was originally. It doesn't feel as great as it did. And I remember being in this cycle where almost every 6 months I was buying a new car. I didn't know why. There was nothing wrong with my car, but I liked the feeling of having the new car. And so I spent lots of money. Luckily, I was pretty good at it, so sometimes I could make money in doing that. But I think for most people, I see this very often. They buy a house every couple years, and they think that the new house is going to make their life better. They buy a new car, and they think that the new car is going to make their life better. They buy new clothes and new stuff and everything else, and their life doesn't actually get better. And that's why when we do a financial plan, I think it's really important to look at 5 things. And this is just for me. Maybe some of these things don't pertain to you, but I think it's important to have your faith in line, your family in line, your finances, your fitness, and some fun. And I think if you can master those 5 things, you can live a pretty great life. And I also think that it's pretty easy to see people who have missed out on maybe 2 or 3 of those things and really focused only on the other 2 live a pretty miserable life. And a lot of that comes from this consumption mentality that you're going to be happy when. And that's why I'm so thankful to the financial industry that I learned how to be happy regardless of where we're at financially. And we've done very, very well financially, and we've also had challenging times financially. And what's interesting and what's fascinating is that you can learn to be happy in both. And more importantly than that, your happiness doesn't come from what you can buy. It doesn't come from the government. It comes from your faith. It comes from your family. It comes from your business and you striving to do better financially and to understand how those things work. It comes from you being healthy, and it comes from you having fun. And so if you can get rid of all of the things that don't actually make you happy, and you can save the money that you've been spending on those and the time and the resources and everything else, and you can spend time on the things that actually make you happy, regardless of what they tell you should make you happy, your life will change. And it starts with putting a budget together and figuring out what you have coming in and what you have going out. Maybe part of it is changing the job that you have. Maybe you thought that having a bunch of money was going to make you happy, but you're missing out on time with your family. Maybe you're missing out on time with your your faith. Maybe you're missing out on time having fun and your fitness, and you're sacrificing all of these things to make an extra $10,000 a year that doesn't make you any happier, that you could maybe take a little bit lower paying job that freed up your time and your income, that you could actually be happy. Or maybe you're working at a job that pays you great, but you're just not happy and you want to strive to become an entrepreneur and have freedom of time and make more money, and you like the struggle of things working and not working, and you want to have a bigger impact. Whatever it might be, it starts with that evaluation of going through a budget, figuring out what you want and what you don't want. And the challenge is nobody is taught that in school. Nobody's taught how money works. Our parents don't teach us. The school doesn't teach us. And I wish that we spent more time simply just focused on figuring out what we want out of life and how to go get it. And I think that you, myself, people would be so much happier if they figured that out instead of what most people do, which is become a consumer. They watch a lot of TV, they are on the internet a lot, and it tells them what they should buy, what they should spend their money on, their resources, their time. And then when they get those things, it doesn't actually make them any happier. So I challenge you to do that, to take the time to actually figure out what you want and how to get it.
What it's led to is a population that's angry, frustrated, hates institutions. It's not acting constructively to try to respond to this. There is popular mobilization and activism, but in very self-destructive directions. It's taking the form of unfocused anger, attacks on one another, and on vulnerable targets. That's what happens in cases like this. It is corrosive of social relations, but that's the point. The point is to make people hate and fear each other and look out only for themselves and don't do anything for anyone else. One place you see it strikingly is on April 15th. April 15th is kind of a measure, the day you pay your taxes, of how democratic a society is. If a society is really democratic, April 15th would be a day of celebration. It's a day when the population gets together, decides to fund the programs and activities that they have formulated and agreed upon. What could be better than that? So you should celebrate it. It's not the way it is in the United States. It's a day of mourning. It's a day in which some alien power, has nothing to do with you, is coming down to steal your hard-earned money, and you do everything you can to keep them from doing it. Well, that is a kind of a measure of the extent to which, at least in popular consciousness, democracy is actually functioning.
Yeah, and I had never really thought about it from that aspect of that April 15th, paying your taxes should be this joyous thing. And I don't remember it being as big of a deal when I was younger. Maybe I didn't focus on money as much. But I feel like today, more and more so, like every year it seems like, and especially over these last couple years, I'm less and less excited about paying taxes. I'm more and more frustrated with where my money's going, and probably also the lack of control that I have on saying where it should go. And then it funds a lot of things that I don't believe in, that aren't part of my faith, that aren't part of my family, aren't part of the things that I believe in, that I don't think are good for the country. And it's unfortunate that they can almost by force, I shouldn't say almost, it is actually by force, come in and take that money and then use it for whatever the heck that it is that they want. And there's almost no accountability. The Pentagon can lose trillions of dollars and nobody says anything, and this money just disappears, and it's being filtered, and they send money to a country. A guy like Robert Menendez goes on there and he gets in trouble because he's been sending money over to Egypt, and then they give him a portion of that money back. And it's just crazy that the amount of corruption that goes on in the government and how long it's gone on for. It's kind of that I would almost say like acceptance by not doing anything, right? Like, yeah, we know we're not supposed to do it, but nobody really says anything, so it just keeps happening. So it's almost like you're saying that it's okay to do it because you're not doing anything about it. And that's happened for so long that it's almost like so many of them do it. And then when they get caught, there's almost real no punishment for it. It's like, hey, slap on the wrist, now go back and do your job, or maybe we'll move you over to this other thing. And same thing with the guy that I just mentioned. He's been in trouble multiple times for similar stuff. And it's so weird that they still end up as a politician taking care of things when we know that they're blatantly corrupt. So how do these things happen, and how do people actually stand up and make a difference? And that's really what we're going to get into next. And I love this part of it, and that my hope is that this video did not, my real hope is that this video did not dismay you, that it didn't make you go, well, all of these things are against me. I guess that it's never going to work out for me and I don't have an opportunity. Because we know that that's not true. We know that there are plenty of people who come to this country with nothing. They start further behind than we do being born in this country, and they're able to make tremendous progress here. And so there's tremendous opportunity. But I think that we also need to understand our responsibility. And I think a lot of this is what has changed, in that the right to vote, and we like to talk a lot about women not having the right to vote, but if you really look into the history of it, that it wasn't because we didn't want women's opinions on things, but because the ability to vote meant something. And it came with a lot of responsibility. Part of that responsibility meant going to war. And so there was a bigger connection between what you were voting for and really your responsibility for voting for it. And there's been such a huge disconnection from that now, in that a lot of people don't necessarily have to pay the price for the things that they vote for, yet they can still vote for them. They don't even have to have any logical understanding. And if you've ever argued on Facebook or on social media, you know this, that people have no concept outside of what they've been taught in school about the realities of life. And so they vote for these things that are not in their best interest, but because they've watched enough television, they think that it's what's good for the country and what's good for themselves. And they're literally voting against the things that they believe in simply because they've been told that this is what they should believe. And that responsibility, if there's a way that we could put that back on the American people, that maybe not if you want the right to vote, you have to be willing to go to war, but maybe there needs to be a higher level of responsibility with what you're voting for. And I don't know how to do that, but that's something that we should definitely get into. And so, again, I hope that this video was not a downer for you. And in this next clip, Norm is going to talk about some of the things that we still can do. It's not too late. It's not too late to make a difference for our country. It's not too late to make things better. And Norm's going to go into some of those things as we kind of close this out.
Not a very attractive picture. The society would be like. I think we can give some guidelines, and more significant, we can ask how we can progress in that direction. John Dewey, the leading social philosopher in the late 20th century, he argued that until all institutions, production, commerce, media, unless they're all under participatory democratic control, we will not have a functioning democratic society. Where there are structures of authority, domination, and hierarchy, somebody gives the order, somebody takes them, they are not self-justifying. They have to justify themselves. They have a burden of proof to meet.
The way things change is because lots of people are working all the time. And, they're working in their communities, in their workplace, or wherever they happen to be, and they're building up the basis for popular movements which are going to make changes. That's the way everything has ever happened in history.
Take, say, freedom of speech. One of the real achievements of American society. It's first in the world in that. It's not in the Bill of Rights. It's not in the Constitution. Freedom of speech issues began to come to the Supreme Court in the early 20th century. The major contributions came in the 1960s. One of the leading ones was a case involving the civil rights movement. Well, by then you had a mass popular movement which was demanding rights, refusing to back down, and in that context, the Supreme Court did establish a pretty high standard of freedom of speech, or take, say, women's rights. Women also began identifying oppressive structures, refusing to accept them, bringing other people to join with them. Well, that's how rights are won. But the activists are people who have created the rights that we enjoy. They're not only carrying out policies based on information that they're receiving, but also contributing to the understanding. Remember, it's a reciprocal process.
That you have a great deal of
You try to do things, you learn. You learn about what the world is like. That feeds back to the understanding of how to go on. There's huge opportunities. It is a very free society, still the freest in the world. Government has very limited capacity to coerce. Corporate business may try to coerce, but they don't have the mechanism. So there's a lot that can be done if people organize, struggle for their rights as they've done in the past, and they can win many victories.
Yeah, and I love that. So it's not this idea of just becoming more passive and more domicile. It's the idea that we need to actually take action. That's why I love the financial literacy aspect and teaching people how to do better financially, because I think it impacts every single aspect of life. And the things that I've learned have changed my life tremendously. And simply just some of the things that I've mentioned earlier, but being able to find happiness with or without money, I think will change your life. And it'll change the impact that you want. And then also understanding what you want out of life and taking the time to figure that out. And then also understanding how to go get it. And I think that if people were taught how to do those things in school, we'd see a very different society. But we've got to understand that that's not necessarily what is wanted for us from those people who control the world, if that's what you want to call it. So your ability to take that time and effort, and I appreciate you sticking around to the end. If you've made it this far, hopefully you've already liked and subscribed. But I think that if you've made it this far, you've learned a lot probably about yourself and about society that you didn't realize had happened beforehand. And that's why it's so important to understand these concepts of how money works and taking your finances and your life into your hands. And then also that aspect of solidarity, of understanding that it's not just about you, it's about our kids, it's about our families, it's about our communities. And the only way I think for those things to get better is to make people stronger financially. That when you have the ability to take time off, and you have the ability, you have 3-6 months of income set aside, and your job tells you to do something that you don't like, you can take the time to go find another job. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck or worse than that, you don't really have the ability to do that. You're not very free. I think he mentioned that labor or working is very similar to slavery. Well, I think the new slavery is really debt, and that you're working paycheck to paycheck. All of your life is going to pay for things and to pay for interest and to pay for debt that you've already bought and forgotten that you've bought. And so if they can keep people in that cycle, they make tremendous amounts of money, keeping us in this cycle of wanting things that we don't really want and spending our life and our time and our resources to go get them, simply because it's going to make us happy. And in the end, we know that all those things that we chase don't actually make us happy. So if you can get that out of this video and then take the time to actually understand the other pieces of getting your financial life in order, I think it will absolutely change your life. And as always, I appreciate you. Take care, and I'll catch you later. Bye.